Hey there, tonight we're stepping back into a world where kingdoms rose like morning mist over mountain ranges, where power was measured in fortresses and silk, and where three rivals spent centuries locked in an elaborate dance of war, diplomacy, and cultural one-upmanship. You're about to discover that old Korea was far more complex and fascinating than you probably imagined. And frankly, you might find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about Korea, the North included. So now, kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. You just traveled back to the Korean peninsula around the 1st century CE, a landscape of misty mountains, winding rivers, and scattered tribal communities, slowly coalescing into something far more ambitious. While Rome was busy conquering half the known world, the Korean peninsula was quietly orchestrating its own transformation, one that would last nearly 7 centuries and create some of the most sophisticated civilizations East Asia had ever seen. This wasn't a sudden fracturing, mind you. The emergence of Goguryeo, Beach, and Silla happened gradually, like watching 3 flowers bloom in different corners of the same garden. Each kingdom developed its own personality, its own ambitions, and its own particular brand of medieval swagger. Goguryeo claimed the northern mountains and promptly decided they owned everything within a 1,000-mile radius. Beach settled into the fertile southwest and began dreaming of maritime empires. Silla, tucked away in the southeastern corner, watched and waited with the patience of a cat, studying a particularly interesting mouse. The irony is delicious. While these 3 kingdoms would spend the next several centuries trying to destroy each other, they were simultaneously creating one of the most culturally rich periods in Korean history. It's rather like watching 3 master chefs compete by creating increasingly elaborate dishes, except the dishes were cities, the ingredients were human lives, and the judges were Chinese emperors who kept changing the rules. What makes this period particularly fascinating is how each kingdom developed along completely different lines. Goguryeo became the mountain fortress specialists, building their capital at Pyongyang and developing a military culture that would make Sparta look like a Sunday school picnic. Their kings ruled from palaces carved into mountainsides, surrounded by walls that seemed to grow directly from the rock itself. They perfected the art of making their neighbors deeply uncomfortable. Beach, meanwhile, took a more cosmopolitan approach. They established their capital at Wuryeseong, modern Seoul, and later moved to Ungjin and then Sabai, each relocation representing not defeat but strategic repositioning. These weren't military retreats, they were calculated moves in a chess game that lasted centuries. Beach became the kingdom of elegant Buddhism, sophisticated art, and diplomatic finesse. If Goguryeo was the warrior, Beach was the artist-philosopher. And then there was Silla, initially the smallest and seemingly most vulnerable of the 3. Centered around Jeonju, they developed something unprecedented, a rigid social hierarchy called the bone rank system that would make European feudalism look positively egalitarian. But here's the beautiful irony. This rigid system actually created incredible stability, allowing Silla to play the long game while their neighbors exhausted themselves in constant warfare. The Chinese, naturally, watched all this with the sort of paternal interest that empires reserve for particularly promising proteges. Sometimes they supported one kingdom sometimes another, always with an eye toward eventual absorption into their own sphere of influence. The Three Kingdoms period became a delicate balance between maintaining independence and avoiding the sort of attention that results in Chinese armies marching over your borders with conquest in mind. What's particularly remarkable is how quickly these kingdoms developed their own distinct identities. Within a few generations, you could identify a Goguryeo noble by his military bearing and fortress-building obsession, a beach aristocrat by his Buddhist scholarship and maritime trading connections, and a Silla royal by the intricate golden crown that proclaimed his exact position in the bone rank hierarchy. These weren't just political entities, they were entire civilizations, each convinced of its own cultural superiority. The Three Kingdoms period officially began when these regional powers stopped being tribal confederations and started calling themselves kingdoms, complete with royal courts, standing armies, and the sort of elaborate ceremonial protocols that make diplomacy both possible and insufferably complicated. By the time this transformation was complete, the Korean peninsula had become something unprecedented in East Asian history, a region where three equally matched powers could maintain their independence for centuries, creating a cultural flowering that would influence Korean identity for millennia to come. Now, let's venture north and mainly focus on Goguryeo, the kingdom that turned mountain fortress building into an art form and made paranoia into a viable foreign policy. If you've ever wondered what happens when an entire civilization decides that the best defense is making everyone else too nervous to attack, Goguryeo provides the perfect case study. Founded around 37 BCE by Jumong, a figure so legendary that separating historical fact from mythological embellishment becomes an exercise in creative archaeology, Goguryeo quickly established itself as the peninsula's most militaristic kingdom. Jumong, according to the legends, was born from an egg, could shoot arrows with supernatural accuracy, and had a rather complicated relationship with his divine parentage. Whether any of this is true hardly matters. What matters is that Goguryeo believed it, and belief has a way of making kingdoms remarkably confident about their territorial ambitions. The geography helped, of course. Goguryeo occupied the mountainous regions of northern Korea and southern Manchuria, territory that was practically designed for defensive warfare. Mountains, rivers, and forests created natural barriers that the Goguryeo engineers enhanced with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. They didn't just build fortresses, they carved entire cities into mountainsides, creating defensive networks that could withstand sieges lasting years. Take Ansi Fortress, for instance. In 645 CE, this particular mountain stronghold held off a massive Tang Chinese invasion force for months, despite being outnumbered by ratios that should have made resistance mathematically impossible. The Chinese Emperor Taizong himself led the siege, bringing along his entire military apparatus and the sort of confidence that comes from having conquered most of the known world. Ansi's defenders responded by dropping rocks on his head, literally. The emperor returned to China with a wounded eye and a new appreciation for Goguryeo engineering. But Goguryeo real genius lay not just in their defensive capabilities, but in their offensive ambitions. This was a kingdom that looked at the vast expanse of Manchuria and northeastern China and thought, you know what, we could use some more territory. Their expansion northward brought them into direct conflict with Chinese dynasties who had grown accustomed to thinking of the region as their backyard. The resulting wars lasted centuries and created a military culture that permeated every aspect of Goguryeo society. The capital at Pyongyang became a testament to this martial philosophy. Palace complexes were built like fortresses, with multiple defensive perimeters and escape routes carved directly into the bedrock. The royal tombs, magnificent affairs decorated with murals depicting everything from hunting scenes to cosmic mythologies, were constructed like underground cities, complete with drainage systems and architectural features that suggested the deceased might need to defend themselves in the afterlife. What's particularly fascinating about Goguryeo is how they managed to maintain their independence while simultaneously provoking every major power in East Asia. The Chinese dynasties of Wei, Jin, Sui, Tang all took turns trying to subdue them, usually with massive armies and grand strategic plans that looked brilliant on paper and collapsed spectacularly when confronted with Goguryeo combination of terrain advantages and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. The Sui dynasty, for example, launched multiple invasions in the early 7th century, each one larger and more ambitious than the last. Emperor Yang sent armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, supported by elaborate supply chains and siege equipment that represented the pinnacle of Chinese military technology. Goguryeo response was elegantly simple. They retreated to their mountain fortresses, let the Chinese exhaust themselves in futile sieges, and then emerged to harass supply lines and pick off stragglers. It was asymmetric warfare elevated to an art form. King Yonyu, who ruled during much of this period, perfected the art of diplomatic misdirection. He would send tribute to China when convenient, declare independence when profitable, and form alliances with other kingdoms when strategically advantageous. His foreign policy resembled a particularly complex chess game played by someone who kept changing the rules mid-game. The Chinese weren't the only ones who found Goguryeo problematic. The kingdom's expansion southward brought them into conflict with Beech and Silla, creating the sort of three-way rivalry that makes military historians either ecstatic or deeply depressed, depending on their temperament. Goguryeo approach to these conflicts was characteristically direct. They built more fortresses, recruited more soldiers, and generally behaved as if the entire peninsula was their rightful inheritance. Scholars still debate whether Goguryeo aggressive expansionism was driven by economic necessity, cultural imperialism, or simple territorial ambition. The truth is probably all three, seasoned with a healthy dose of the sort of confidence that comes from spending generations carving cities out of solid rock. When your national identity is built around the premise that mountains can be conquered and empires can be defied, compromise becomes a foreign concept. The kingdom's internal structure reflected this martial focus. The aristocracy was essentially a military caste, with social status determined largely by military achievement and fortress-building expertise. Art, literature, and philosophy all served the larger goal of creating a warrior culture capable of defending mountainous terrain against overwhelming odds. Even their Buddhist temples and Goguryeo did embrace Buddhism, eventually were built like fortifications, with walls thick enough to withstand siege engines and courtyards designed for defensive archery. By the 6th century, Goguryeo had become something unprecedented in East Asian history, a medium-sized kingdom that had successfully resisted absorption by China for over half a millennium. Their success inspired both admiration and deep anxiety among their neighbors, creating a political dynamic that would shape the entire region for centuries to come. While Goguryeo was busy carving fortresses out of mountains and making Chinese emperors nervous, Beech was pursuing a rather different sort of ambition in the peninsula's fertile southwest. If Goguryeo was the warrior kingdom, Beech was the sophisticated cosmopolitan cousin who preferred elegant diplomacy to crude fortress building, though they were perfectly capable of both when circumstances required. Founded around 18 BCE by Anzhou, another of those conveniently legendary figures whose historical existence becomes less important than the cultural identity he represented. Beech established itself in the Han River Valley with all the advantages that fertile plains and navigable waterways could provide, while their northern neighbors were busy turning mountains into military installations. Beech was developing trade networks, Buddhist scholarship, and the sort of cultural refinement that made other kingdoms slightly envious and considerably more sophisticated by association. The kingdom's early capital at Wuryeseong, roughly modern-day Seoul, occupied one of the peninsula's most strategically valuable positions. The Han River provided access to both inland territories and coastal trade routes, while the surrounding plains offered agricultural productivity that Goguryeo's mountainous terrain simply couldn't match. It was the sort of location that practically guaranteed prosperity, assuming you could defend it from neighbors who might develop territorial ambitions. And territorial ambitions were, unfortunately, something Beek's neighbors possessed in abundance. The kingdom's history reads like a masterclass in strategic repositioning, with capitals moved from Wuryeseong to Ungjin, and finally to Sabai, as military pressures and political calculations shifted. These weren't panicked retreats. They were calculated moves by a kingdom that understood the difference between tactical withdrawal and strategic defeat. The move to Ungjin in 475 CE, for instance, came after Goguryeo's King Jiangsu decided that Beek's prosperity was becoming insufficiently respectful of Goguryeo's regional ambitions. The resulting conflict demonstrated Beek's characteristic response to military pressure. They relocated their capital, reorganized their defenses, and immediately began plotting revenge through diplomacy rather than direct confrontation. It was the sort of long-term thinking that drove their more militaristic neighbors to distraction. Beek's real genius lay in understanding that cultural influence could be just as powerful as military conquest. They became the peninsula's primary conduit for Chinese Buddhism, Confucian philosophy, and artistic techniques, transforming these foreign influences into distinctly Korean forms that would eventually spread throughout East Asia. The Seokguram Grotto and Bulguksa Temple, though technically built later under Silla rule, represent artistic traditions that Baekje pioneered. The kingdom's Buddhist culture was particularly sophisticated. Baekje monks didn't just copy Chinese practices. They developed their own interpretations, created their own artistic styles, and established their own monastic traditions. The gilt bronze Maitreya in Meditation, now housed in Seoul's National Museum, represents the sort of artistic achievement that makes art historians speak in hushed tones about transcendent cultural synthesis. But Baekje's most remarkable achievement was their maritime expansion. While Goguryeo was focused on continental empire building, and Silla was perfecting their internal hierarchy, Baekje was quietly establishing trade relationships and cultural exchanges across the Yellow Sea. They maintained diplomatic relations with the southern dynasties of China, developed extensive trade networks with Japan, and even established temporary footholds on the Chinese coast. King Maryeong, who ruled in the early 6th century, exemplified Baekje's sophisticated approach to statecraft. His tomb, discovered intact in 1971, contained artifacts from across East Asia, Chinese mirrors, Southeast Asian spices, locally produced gold jewelry, and burial goods that told the story of a kingdom connected to trade networks spanning thousands of miles. The tomb's construction itself, with its perfectly fitted bricks and sophisticated drainage system, demonstrated engineering skills that rivaled anything being built in contemporary China. The relationship with Japan was particularly complex and culturally significant. Baekje scholars, monks, and artisans played crucial roles in Japan's adoption of Buddhism, Chinese writing systems, and continental political structures. The Nihon Shoki, Japan's ancient chronicle, records numerous Baekje immigrants who became influential figures in Japanese court society. It was cultural diplomacy on a scale that would make modern foreign ministries jealous. This cultural influence created a feedback loop that strengthened Baekje's position on the peninsula. Japanese support, military, economic, and diplomatic, provided leverage against Goguryeo, and Silla that pure military strength couldn't match. When Baekje found themselves under pressure from their peninsula neighbors, they could call upon Japanese assistance, creating a geopolitical dynamic that transcended simple territorial conflicts. The kingdom's internal structure reflected this cosmopolitan orientation. Baekje's aristocracy was educated in Chinese classics, Buddhist philosophy, and international trade practices. Their capital cities featured sophisticated urban planning, with districts for foreign merchants, quarters for Buddhist monasteries, and royal complexes that combined Korean architectural traditions with continental influences. Even their approach to warfare demonstrated this cultural sophistication. Rather than Goguryeo fortress-based defensive strategy, Baekje developed mobile tactics that emphasized speed, coordination, and strategic withdrawal. They built fewer fortresses, but used them more effectively, creating defensive networks that could channel enemy forces into carefully prepared killing zones. The kingdom's agricultural innovations were equally impressive. Baekje engineers developed advanced irrigation systems introduced new crops from China and Southeast Asia, and created farming techniques that supported population densities unprecedented in Korean history. The surplus agricultural production funded their cultural projects, military expeditions, and diplomatic initiatives across East Asia. By the 6th century, beach had become something unique in East Asian history, a middle-sized kingdom that exercised cultural influence far beyond its military capabilities. Their scholars were respected in Chinese imperial courts, their artisans were sought after in Japan, and their diplomatic initiatives shaped regional politics across the Yellow Sea. It was soft power before the concept existed, wielded by a kingdom that understood that cultural influence could last longer than military conquest. And then there was Silla, tucked away in the peninsula's southeastern corner, like a patient spider watching flies stumble into increasingly elaborate webs, while Goguryeo was busy antagonizing Chinese emperors, and Beech was cultivating sophisticated cultural exchanges. Silla was quietly perfecting something far more insidious, a social system so rigidly hierarchical that it made European feudalism look like a casual social gathering. The bone rank system, Kalpam in Korean, represented one of history's most sophisticated attempts to organize human society according to hereditary status. Imagine a world where your bloodline determined not just your social position, but your clothing colors, house size, vehicle decorations, and even the materials from which your eating utensils could be made. Then make it completely immutable, lasting for centuries, and you begin to understand Silla's approach to social organization. At the apex sat the Seongal, the sacred bone rank reserved for those eligible for the throne. These individuals didn't just rule Silla, they were considered semi-divine beings whose very existence maintained cosmic order. Below them, the Jingal, or true bone rank, encompassed the highest nobility, followed by 6 levels of dupum, or head ranks, that determined everything from government positions to marriage partners with mathematical precision. The genius of this system, and yes, it was genius, albeit of a particularly suffocating variety, lay in how it created absolute stability through absolute rigidity, while Goguryeo and Beech exhausted themselves in constant warfare and political upheaval. Silla's bone rank system eliminated most sources of internal conflict by making social mobility literally impossible. You were born into your rank, lived within its constraints, and died knowing exactly where you stood in the cosmic hierarchy. But here's where Silla's story becomes genuinely fascinating. This rigid internal structure actually enabled remarkable external flexibility. Because domestic politics were essentially frozen, Silla's rulers could focus entirely on foreign policy and military strategy. They became the peninsula's master diplomatic manipulators, playing Goguryeo against Beech, China against Japan, and everyone against their own long-term interests. Queen Seondeok, who ruled from 632 to 647 CE, exemplified this strategic patience. She was Silla's first female ruler, a development that would have been impossible under less rigid social systems, where gender roles remained fluid and therefore contestable. The bone rank system, by codifying everything else so completely, actually created space for unprecedented female political authority. Seondeok used this authority to pursue policies that seemed almost impossibly long-term. Infrastructure projects, educational initiatives, and diplomatic relationships that wouldn't pay dividends for generations. The Queen's most famous achievement was the construction of Cheomseongdi, an astronomical observatory that still stands in Jeonju today. This wasn't just a building, it was a statement about Silla's intellectual ambitions and their understanding of rulership as a cosmic responsibility. The structure's 362 stones supposedly represented the days of the lunar year, while its height and proportions incorporated mathematical relationships that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both astronomy and architecture. Silla's capital at Jeonju, originally called Seoribal, became a showcase for this combination of rigid social organization and remarkable cultural achievement. The city was laid out according to principles that reflected the bone rank hierarchy, with residential districts, market areas, and religious sites all organized to reinforce social distinctions. Yet, within these constraints, Silla's artisans created some of the most beautiful objects in Korean history. Those golden crowns, for instance, intricate constructions of gold, jade, and precious stones that proclaimed their wearer's exact position in the social hierarchy, represent goldsmithing techniques that modern artisans struggle to replicate. The tomb of King Maryeong contained over 17,000 individual artifacts, each one crafted with a precision that suggests entire guilds of specialists devoted to creating objects that only a handful of people would ever see. The economic implications of the bone rank system were equally complex. By fixing social positions, Silla created a remarkably stable labor force and eliminated the sort of social mobility that drove economic innovation in other societies. But this stability also enabled long-term planning and capital accumulation on a scale that more fluid societies couldn't match. Silla's merchants knew exactly where they stood, what they could aspire to, and how to operate within constraints that were absolute but predictable. This internal stability proved crucial when Silla began their campaign for peninsula domination. Unlike Goguryeo direct military approach or Baekdu's cultural diplomacy, Silla pursued unification through systematic alliance building and strategic patience. They allied with Tang China not out of weakness, but because they understood that Chinese support could provide the decisive advantage in their conflicts with Goguryeo and Baekdu. The alliance with Tang was masterfully calculated. Silla offered tribute and nominal submission in exchange for Chinese military support against their peninsula rivals, but they were careful to maintain enough independence to avoid the sort of direct absorption that had befallen other Chinese client states. It was a delicate balance that required diplomatic skills honed through centuries of managing rigid internal hierarchies. King Munmu, who completed Silla's unification of the peninsula in the 670s, represented the culmination of this strategic tradition. He understood that military conquest meant nothing without administrative integration, and that administrative integration required the sort of systematic organization that the bone rank system had perfected. His unification wasn't just military, it was bureaucratic, creating administrative structures that could absorb and organize territories with populations that had never experienced Scylla's particular brand of social engineering. What makes Scylla's achievement particularly remarkable is how they maintained their cultural identity while absorbing kingdoms with completely different social systems. Goguryеo's military aristocracy and Bicte's cosmopolitan merchants were integrated into Scylla's bone rank hierarchy through processes that were both systematic and surprisingly flexible. The rigid system that had initially seemed like a weakness became the framework for creating unified Korean identity. By the time of unification, Scylla had demonstrated something unprecedented in East Asian history. That extreme social rigidity could coexist with remarkable political flexibility, and that patience could be more effective than either military aggression or cultural sophistication in achieving long-term strategic goals. Now, while these three kingdoms were busy perfecting their respective brands of political organization, Goguryеo's militant fortress building, Bicte's cosmopolitan diplomacy, and Scylla's rigidly hierarchical patience, something quietly revolutionary was transforming the spiritual landscape of the entire peninsula. Buddhism arrived not with conquering armies or imperial edicts, but with monks carrying sutras, artists bearing new techniques, and ideas that would reshape Korean civilization in ways that military conquest never could. The introduction of Buddhism to Korea represents one of history's more elegant cultural transformations. Unlike Christianity's often violent spread through Europe or Islam's military expansion across the Middle East, Buddhism arrived in Korea through trade routes, diplomatic exchanges, and the sort of gradual cultural osmosis that makes historians debate precise dates and methods for centuries afterward. Goguryeo received Buddhism first around 372 CE, when a Chinese monk named Sundo arrived at the court of King Sajurim with Buddhist texts and probably a considerable amount of cultural confidence. The king's acceptance of this foreign religion wasn't particularly surprising. Goguryеo's rulers had always been pragmatic about adopting useful innovations, whether they were military technologies, administrative systems, or spiritual practices that might provide cosmic legitimacy for their territorial ambitions. What's fascinating is how quickly Buddhism became integrated into Goguryеo's existing warrior culture. Rather than replacing traditional shamanic practices, Buddhism provided an additional layer of spiritual authority that complemented the kingdom's military focus. Goguryеo's Buddhist temples were built like fortresses, their monasteries organized like military compounds, and their monks trained in martial arts alongside meditation techniques. It was Buddhism with a distinctly Goguryeo flavor, contemplative but ready for siege warfare. Bicte's approach to Buddhism was characteristically more sophisticated. The religion arrived there around 384 CE, brought by another Chinese monk named Marananta. But Bicte's adoption was more systematic and culturally transformative. Rather than simply adding Buddhism to existing practices, Bicte's rulers used the new religion to enhance their kingdom's cultural prestige. and diplomatic connections. King Chimnyu and his successors sponsored massive temple construction projects, supported Buddhist scholarship, and used their kingdom's growing reputation for Buddhist learning to strengthen relationships with Chinese dynasties and Japanese courts. Bikji Buddhism became famous for its artistic achievements, those gilt bronze Buddhist sculptures that seemed to capture enlightenment in metal, the temple architecture that balanced Korean traditions with continental innovations, and the scholarly commentaries that influenced Buddhist thought throughout East Asia. The Korean Buddhist monks who traveled to Japan in the 6th and 7th centuries were predominantly from Bikj, carrying with them not just religious teachings, but also architectural techniques, artistic styles, and scholarly traditions that would fundamentally shape Japanese civilization. It was cultural diplomacy through spiritual influence, executed with the sort of long-term vision that made Bikj's political strategy so effective. Silla's relationship with Buddhism was, predictably, more complex and ultimately more transformative. The religion arrived later, around 527 CE, and faced considerable resistance from the bone rank aristocracy, who correctly perceived that Buddhist ideas about spiritual equality might undermine their carefully constructed social hierarchy. The story of Ikkadan's martyrdom perfectly encapsulates this tension. Ikkadan, a court official who had converted to Buddhism, volunteered to be executed to demonstrate the religion's power and legitimacy. According to legend, when he was beheaded, white milk rather than blood flowed from his neck, the earth shook, and the sun darkened, supernatural events that convinced King Beofung to officially adopt Buddhism. Whether any of this actually happened is less important than what it reveals about Silla's approach to religious transformation: dramatic, systematic, and ultimately more thorough than either of their rivals. What makes Silla's Buddhist adoption particularly interesting is how they managed to integrate the religion into the bone rank system without fundamentally altering their social structure. Buddhist monasteries became part of the hierarchical framework, with abbot positions distributed according to hereditary rank and temple administration organized to reinforce rather than challenge existing power structures. It was a remarkable feat of cultural engineering that allowed Silla to gain Buddhism's benefits while maintaining their social system's rigid stability. The transformation wasn't just political or artistic, it was deeply intellectual. Korean Buddhism developed its own philosophical schools, its own interpretations of crucial sutras, and its own approaches to meditation and monastic life. The Hwarang, Silla's elite warrior scholars, combined Buddhist philosophical training with martial arts and Confucian ethical education, creating a synthesis that was uniquely Korean. These young aristocrats, and they were invariably aristocratic, drawn from the upper levels of the bone rank system, underwent training that combined physical conditioning, spiritual discipline, and scholarly education. They studied Buddhist texts alongside military strategy, practiced meditation alongside archery, and developed a code of ethics that emphasized both personal cultivation and service to the state. It was a medieval educational system that would have impressed Renaissance humanists with its integration of spiritual, intellectual, and physical development, the impact on Korean art and architecture was equally profound. Buddhist temples became centers of artistic innovation, where Korean craftsmen adapted Chinese and Central Asian techniques to create distinctly Korean aesthetic traditions. The pagoda styles, Buddha statue proportions, and temple layout patterns developed during the Three Kingdoms period established artistic conventions that would influence Korean culture for over a millennium. But perhaps Buddhism's most important contribution was its role in creating a shared cultural identity that transcended the political divisions between the Three Kingdoms. A Goguryeo monk and a Beach scholar could communicate through shared Buddhist texts, artistic traditions, and philosophical frameworks that provided common ground despite their kingdoms' political hostilities. It was cultural unification through spiritual means, laying the groundwork for eventual political unification. Under Silla, the monastery schools became centers of learning that preserved and transmitted not just Buddhist teachings, but also Chinese literature, historical texts, and scientific knowledge. Korean monks traveled to China and India for advanced study, returning with new ideas that enriched Korean intellectual life. The famous monk Wonhyo, who lived during the 7th century, developed philosophical interpretations of Buddhism that influenced thought throughout East Asia and demonstrated that Korean Buddhist scholarship had achieved genuine intellectual independence. By the time of Silla's political unification, Buddhism had become so thoroughly integrated into Korean culture that it was no longer a foreign import, but a distinctly Korean spiritual tradition, one that had transformed 3 separate kingdoms into a civilization with shared values, artistic traditions, and intellectual frameworks. While kings plotted in mountain fortresses and monks copied sutras in monastery scriptoriums, the vast majority of Korea's population was engaged in the rather more mundane business of growing rice, weaving silk, and navigating the complex social hierarchies that determined everything from marriage prospects to the color of one's roof tiles. Daily life in the Three Kingdoms was a delicate balance between seasonal agricultural rhythms and the sort of rigid social protocols that made medieval European etiquette look refreshingly casual. Let's begin with the farmers, who comprised roughly 80% of the population and whose seasonal labors funded the kingdom's military ambitions, cultural achievements, and architectural extravagances. Korean agriculture during this period was remarkably sophisticated, utilizing irrigation systems, crop rotation techniques, and farming implements that represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about coaxing sustenance from monsoon-dependent soil. The agricultural year began with spring planting, when entire villages would mobilize for the backbreaking work of preparing rice paddies. This wasn't simply individual farming, it was community-wide coordination that required sophisticated social organization. Families would pool labor, share tools, and coordinate planting schedules with the sort of precision that modern agricultural scientists would admire. The bone rank system in Silla, for instance, wasn't just about aristocratic privilege. It provided the organizational framework for managing complex agricultural operations involving hundreds of families. Rice cultivation had arrived from China centuries earlier, but Korean farmers had adapted the techniques to local conditions with characteristic ingenuity. They developed cold-resistant varieties suitable for Korea's harsh winters, created terracing systems that maximized arable land in mountainous regions, and perfected transplanting methods that increased yields while conserving water. The result was agricultural productivity that could support urban populations, standing armies, and the sort of monumental construction projects that required feeding thousands of workers for years at a time. But rice wasn't the only crop. Korean farmers also cultivated barley, millet, soybeans, and various vegetables, creating diversified agricultural systems that provided insurance against crop failures and maintained soil fertility through natural rotation. They raised pigs, chickens, and cattle, though beef was generally reserved for the aristocracy, since cattle were too valuable as draft animals to be casually consumed. The aristocracy, meanwhile, lived in a world of elaborate protocols, silk clothing, and carefully calibrated social interactions that would have exhausted anyone not trained from childhood in the subtleties of hierarchical etiquette. A Silla noble's day began with rituals that proclaimed his bone rank status, specific clothing colors, particular hairstyles, designated eating utensils, and continued with activities that reinforced his position in the social hierarchy. Aristocratic women in Beach and Silla enjoyed considerably more freedom than their counterparts in contemporary China, a situation that bemused Chinese observers and created diplomatic complications when Korean queens attempted to correspond directly with Chinese emperors. These women managed household estates, supervised silk production, and participated in religious ceremonies with authority that reflected Buddhism's relatively egalitarian spiritual principles overlaid on Korea's hierarchical social structures. The production of silk, in particular, became a sophisticated industry that combined technical expertise with artistic achievement. Korean silk was renowned throughout East Asia for its quality and distinctive patterns, with different kingdoms developing signature weaving techniques and dye colors. Beach silk, with its subtle color gradations and complex patterns, was particularly prized in Japanese court circles, while Silla's golden silk threads became symbols of royal authority that were literally woven into the fabric of political power. Artisans occupied a complex position in this hierarchical society, technically of lower status than aristocrats or even prosperous farmers. They possessed skills that made them indispensable to the kingdom's cultural and military ambitions. Goguryeo metalworkers produced the weapons and armor that equipped their fortress-building armies, while also creating the bronze mirrors, gold jewelry, and iron tools that appeared in royal tombs. Their workshops, often located near sources of iron ore and coal, became centers of technical innovation that influenced craftsmanship throughout the peninsula. The daily rhythm of artisan life was governed by seasonal availability of materials and royal commission schedules. A goldsmith working on a royal crown might spend months perfecting techniques for setting jade into gold frameworks, while potters developing new glazes would time their kiln firings to coincide with optimal weather conditions. These weren't just individual craftsmen, they were members of hereditary guilds that passed technical knowledge from generation to generation through apprenticeship systems that were as rigorous as any modern professional training. Trade networks connected these local economies to markets spanning from Central Asia to Japan. Korean merchants, primarily from beach, with their maritime connections, established commercial relationships that brought Chinese silk, Southeast Asian spices, and Japanese silver into Korean markets, while exporting Korean pottery, metalwork, and agricultural products throughout the region. The merchant class developed its own protocols and social networks that sometimes transcended the formal hierarchies of the three kingdoms, creating informal diplomatic channels that complemented official state relations. Urban life in the capitals was a fascinating mixture of cosmopolitan sophistication and rigid social segregation. Jeonju, Silla's capital, was organized into districts that reflected the bone rank system, aristocratic quarters with large compounds and elaborate gardens, artisan neighborhoods with workshops and market stalls, and merchant areas that bustled with trade from across East Asia. The city's layout was designed to reinforce social hierarchies while facilitating the economic activities that sustained the kingdom's power. Perhaps most remarkably, this hierarchical society maintained remarkable stability for centuries. Social mobility was limited, but social functions were clearly defined, creating a system where everyone understood their role and responsibilities. A farmer knew exactly what was expected of him, what protection he could expect from his superiors, and what opportunities existed for his children. An artisan understood his place in the guild hierarchy, his obligations to aristocratic patrons, and the technical standards that governed his craft. Food culture reflected these social divisions with mathematical precision. Aristocrats dined on rice, meat, and imported delicacies, using bronze and silver utensils that proclaimed their rank. Farmers ate barley and millet with occasional meat during festivals, while artisans and merchants enjoyed diets that fell somewhere between these extremes. Even the fermented foods that would eventually become Korean cuisine's signature characteristics, kimchi, soy sauce, fermented bean paste, were initially developed as preservation methods that allowed diverse social classes to maintain nutritional variety throughout Korea's harsh winters. The result was a civilization that combined remarkable cultural achievements with social systems that modern observers might find suffocating, but which provided the stability and organization necessary for the three kingdoms to maintain their independence and cultural identity for over 6 centuries. Now we arrive at the truly entertaining part of our story, the centuries-long game of military chess that the three kingdoms played with each other, using actual armies as pieces and the occasional Chinese intervention as an unwelcome rule change. If you've ever wondered what happens when 3 equally matched powers share the same peninsula for 600 years, the Three Kingdoms period provides a masterclass in creative hostility strategic patience, and the sort of diplomatic complexity that makes modern international relations look refreshingly straightforward. The basic pattern was elegantly simple. Two kingdoms would ally against the third, maintain their partnership just long enough to achieve some tactical advantage, then immediately begin plotting against each other, while their former enemy scrambled to find new allies. It was a triangle of perpetual betrayal that somehow maintained regional stability through constant instability, rather like three people trying to balance on a seesaw designed for two. Goguryeo, with their fortress-building obsession and territorial ambitions, naturally became everyone's primary concern. Their expansion southward threatened both Beach and Silla, while their expansion northward made Chinese dynasties nervous about their Manchurian borders. This created opportunities for diplomatic maneuvering that Beach and Silla exploited with considerable creativity. The alliance between Beach and Silla in the 6th century represents one of history's more cynical diplomatic partnerships. King Seong of Beach and King Jinhu of Silla publicly proclaimed their eternal friendship while privately negotiating the territorial divisions that would follow Goguryeo inevitable defeat. They coordinated military campaigns, shared intelligence, and presented a united front that successfully pushed Goguryeo out of the Han River Valley, one of the peninsula's most strategically valuable regions. But here's where the story becomes deliciously complex. The moment Goguryeo retreated, Silla immediately turned on Beach and seized control of the Han River Valley for themselves. King Seong, who had trusted his Silla allies enough to lead personally in the final campaign against Goguryeo, was killed in battle against his former partners. It was betrayal elevated to an art form, executed with the sort of strategic timing that would have impressed Machiavelli. The Chinese, naturally, watched these developments with the sort of paternal interest that great powers reserve for smaller neighbors whose conflicts might require intervention. The Sui dynasty's attempts to conquer Goguryeo in the early 7th century represented more than simple territorial expansion. They were responding to a regional balance of power that threatened to create a Korean kingdom strong enough to challenge Chinese hegemony in Northeast Asia. Emperor Yang's Korean campaigns were masterpieces of logistical planning and strategic miscalculation. The Chinese assembled armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, supported by elaborate supply networks and siege equipment that represented the pinnacle of medieval military technology. The plan looked brilliant on paper. Overwhelm Goguryeo mountain fortresses through sheer numerical superiority, while preventing Beach and Silla from providing assistance. Goguryeo response was characteristically direct. They retreated to their prepared positions, let the Chinese exhaust themselves in futile sieges, and then emerged to harass supply lines with the sort of guerrilla tactics that would later make Vietnamese generals famous. The Chinese discovered that conquering mountain fortresses defended by people who had spent centuries perfecting siege warfare was considerably more difficult than their strategic planning had suggested. The most famous example was the siege of Yulji Mundiok's campaign against the Chinese at the Salsu River in 612 CE. Yulji feigned retreat, drew the Chinese army deep into Goguryeo territory, then destroyed the bridges behind them and attacked with forces that emerged from prepared positions like deadly mushrooms after rain. It was asymmetric warfare executed with the sort of precision that turns military disasters into legend. But the real diplomatic masterpiece was Scylla's alliance with Tang China in the 7th century. King Munmu understood that Scylla's unification of the peninsula would require eliminating both Goguryeo and Beach, a task that exceeded even Scylla's patient strategic capabilities. The Tang alliance provided the external military support necessary for these conquests, while creating obligations that Scylla would later need to navigate with considerable diplomatic skill. The alliance worked brilliantly initially. Combined Scylla-Tang forces destroyed Beach in 660 CE and conquered Goguryeo in 668 CE, ending the Three Kingdoms period and creating the unified Korean state that Scylla had been planning for centuries. But Tang China's idea of alliance differed significantly from Scylla's understanding of partnership. The Chinese expected their Korean allies to become Chinese provinces, administered by Chinese governors, and integrated into the Tang imperial system. Scylla's response to this expectation was diplomatically elegant and militarily decisive. They politely thanked their Chinese allies for their assistance, formally requested that Tang forces return to China, and when this request was politely declined, began the sort of guerrilla campaign that had made Goguryeo famous. It was rebellion disguised as gratitude, executed with the sort of systematic organization that the bone rank system had perfected. The resulting conflicts demonstrated that Korean resistance to foreign domination transcended the political divisions of the Three Kingdoms period. Former Goguryeo and Beach forces rallied to Scylla's cause, creating a unified Korean identity through shared opposition to Chinese occupation. It was nationalism forged through resistance, uniting populations that had spent centuries fighting each other against a common external threat. The siege warfare during this period was particularly sophisticated. Korean engineers had developed fortress-building techniques that maximized defensive advantages while minimizing resource requirements. Their mountain strongholds were positioned to control strategic passes, river crossings, and trade routes, creating defensive networks that could withstand prolonged sieges while maintaining communication with supporting forces. The diplomatic protocols that governed these conflicts were equally complex. Formal declarations of war, prisoner exchanges, and alliance negotiations all followed established procedures that reflected centuries of accumulated diplomatic experience. Korean kingdoms maintained embassies in each other's capitals, even during active hostilities, creating communication channels that allowed for rapid policy adjustments when strategic circumstances changed. What's particularly remarkable is how these constant conflicts actually strengthened Korean civilization rather than weakening it. The military pressure created incentives for technological innovation, administrative efficiency, and social organization that accelerated cultural development. The Three Kingdoms competition drove them to higher levels of achievement in everything from metallurgy to poetry, creating a cultural flowering that would have been impossible without the stimulus of perpetual strategic rivalry. By the time Silla achieved unification, the peninsula had been transformed by centuries of sophisticated warfare, diplomatic maneuvering, and strategic competition into a civilization capable of resisting Chinese absorption while maintaining cultural independence. It was unification achieved through conflict, creating a Korean identity forged in the crucible of strategic necessity. And so we arrive at the end game, Silla's methodical absorption of their peninsula rivals through a combination of Tang Chinese backing, strategic patience, and the sort of administrative efficiency that turns military conquest into lasting political transformation. Remember that rigid bone rank system we discussed earlier. It turns out that a social structure designed to eliminate internal conflict makes an excellent framework for integrating conquered territories, assuming you can survive the conquest phase without your allies deciding you'd make a more convenient province than partner. The destruction of Beach in 660 CE was conducted with the sort of systematic thoroughness that made it clear Silla had been planning this operation for decades. King Yuja, Beach's final ruler, had made the classic mistake of assuming that past diplomatic relationships would constrain future strategic calculations. When combined Silla-Tang forces surrounded his capital at Sabai, he discovered that Silla's newfound Chinese partnership had fundamentally altered the peninsula's balance of power. The siege itself was almost anticlimactic. Beach's sophisticated urban defenses, designed to withstand the sort of prolonged mountain warfare that Goguryeo specialized in, proved inadequate against the combined siege techniques that Silla had learned from Chinese military advisors. More importantly, Beach's maritime escape routes, those yellow sea connections that had sustained their kingdom for centuries, were blocked by Tang naval forces that controlled the coastal approaches. What followed was textbook conquest administration. Rather than simply destroying Beach's political structures, Silla systematically integrated them into their own governmental framework. Beach aristocrats who submitted were incorporated into appropriate levels of the bone rank system, their administrative expertise preserved and redirected toward Silla's unification project. It was absorption rather than annihilation, executed with the sort of bureaucratic precision that would have impressed Roman provincial administrators. The conquest of Goguryeo in 668 CE required more complex strategies, partly because Goguryeo mountain fortress system remained formidable even after centuries of Chinese military pressure, and partly because Goguryeo political culture was fundamentally incompatible with the sort of hierarchical submission that Silla's bone rank system required. These were people who had spent centuries defining themselves through resistance to external authority, convincing them to accept Silla's social hierarchy required more than military defeat. The final siege of Pyongyang demonstrated how much Korean siege warfare had evolved during the Three Kingdoms period. Combined Silla-Tang forces employed siege engines borrowed from Chinese military technology, but adapted these techniques to the specific challenges that Goguryeo mountain fortifications presented. The result was a siege that that combined Chinese logistical capabilities with Korean understanding of fortress-based defensive strategies. King Bajang's surrender marked the end of Goguryeo as an independent kingdom, but it also created administrative challenges that tested Silla's governmental capabilities. Goguryeo territories extended deep into Manchuria, encompassing populations that had never experienced the sort of centralized administration that the bone rank system required. More problematically, many Goguryeo military leaders retreated northward rather than submit to Silla authority, creating successor states that would complicate Northeast Asian politics for centuries. But here's where Silla's story becomes genuinely remarkable. Having achieved their centuries-long goal of peninsula unification, they immediately discovered that their Chinese allies expected to collect payment for their military assistance in the form of Korean political independence. Tang administrative officials arrived in former Beach and Goguryeo territories with the sort of confidence that suggested they viewed Korean unification as a convenient preliminary to Chinese annexation. Silla's response revealed the strategic sophistication that had enabled their rise to peninsula dominance. Rather than direct confrontation with their overwhelmingly powerful allies, they began a campaign of passive resistance, administrative non-cooperation, and carefully escalated military pressure that gradually made Chinese occupation untenable without ever providing justification for massive Tang retaliation. The process was masterfully orchestrated. Silla officials would politely comply with Chinese administrative directives while ensuring that implementation was delayed, complicated, or subtly sabotaged. Tax collection became mysteriously inefficient. Communication between Chinese administrators and local populations somehow developed translation problems, and supply lines for Chinese garrison forces experienced unexpected difficulties that required constant attention from Tang military commanders. Simultaneously, Silla began providing quiet support to Goguryeo resistance movements in the north, creating security problems that forced Chinese forces to deploy across a much wider territory than they had originally planned. It was insurgency by proxy, allowing Silla to maintain officially friendly relations with Tang while ensuring that Chinese occupation became prohibitively expensive. The military campaigns that finally expelled Chinese forces from the peninsula demonstrated how thoroughly Silla had absorbed the military traditions of their conquered rivals. Former Goguryeo fortress specialists provided expertise in mountain warfare, while former beach naval commanders contributed knowledge of coastal defense strategies. It was unified Korean resistance created through the integration of formerly competing military traditions. King Munmu's victory over Tang forces at the Battle of Miso in 676 CE represented more than military success. It was the moment when Korean political independence was secured through Korean military capabilities rather than Chinese tolerance. The battle itself combined Goguryeo fortress-based defensive tactics with Beek's mobile warfare techniques, executed through Silla's systematic organizational methods. The administrative integration that followed unification was equally impressive. Silla's bone rank system provided the framework for organizing territories that had previously operated under completely different governmental structures, but the system itself was flexible enough to accommodate regional variations and local administrative traditions. Former Goguryeo military administrators became Silla provincial governors, while former beach cultural officials were incorporated into Silla's, expanding educational and religious bureaucracies. What emerged was something unprecedented in Korean history, a unified peninsula state that maintained cultural traditions from all three kingdoms while operating under a single political authority. Goguryeo military traditions, Beek's cultural sophistication, and Silla's administrative efficiency were synthesized into a governmental system that was genuinely Korean rather than simply Silla writ large. The capital at Jeonju became a showcase for this cultural synthesis. Architecture incorporated design elements from all three kingdoms. Court ceremonies combined ritual traditions that had previously been distinctive to particular regions, and the expanded bone rank system created space for aristocratic families whose ancestors had served different royal houses. By 676 CE, Silla had achieved something that had seemed impossible when the Three Kingdoms period began. They had created a unified Korean state that was strong enough to resist Chinese absorption, while sophisticated enough to maintain cultural independence. It was unification through conquest, but conquest that preserved rather than destroyed the cultural achievements that had made the Three Kingdoms period so remarkable. And so we reach the end of our journey through the Three Kingdoms, but endings in history are rarely as neat as the word suggests. The legacy of Goguryeo, Beech, and Silla didn't simply vanish when Silla's armies marched into Pyongyang. It transformed, evolved, and wove itself into the fabric of Korean identity in ways that continue to influence the peninsula today. Over a millennium after the last Three Kingdoms, battle was fought. Consider what Silla's unification actually accomplished. This wasn't merely the military defeat of two rival kingdoms. It was the creation of something entirely new, a unified Korean cultural identity that incorporated elements from three distinct civilizational traditions: Goguryeo fierce independence, their mountain fortress mentality, and their absolute refusal to submit to foreign domination became fundamental aspects of Korean national character. You can trace a direct line from those Goguryeo defenders holding Ansi Fortress against impossible odds to the Korean resistance movements of the 20th century. Beek's cultural sophistication, their diplomatic finesse, and their understanding that soft power could be more effective than military conquest became equally embedded in Korean civilization. The artistic traditions that Beech pioneered, those elegant Buddhist sculptures, the architectural innovations, the sophisticated urban planning, established aesthetic principles that would influence Korean culture for centuries. Even today, Korean cultural exports demonstrate the same combination of local authenticity and international appeal that made Beech Buddhism influential from China to Japan, and Silla's administrative genius, their systematic approach to governance, and their understanding that rigid social structures could coexist with remarkable cultural flexibility, provided the organizational framework for Korean civilization's continued development. The bone rank system eventually disappeared, but the Korean preference for clearly defined hierarchies, systematic education, and merit-based advancement can be traced directly back to Silla's governmental innovations. But perhaps the most important legacy was something more abstract: the demonstration that Korean civilization could maintain its independence and cultural identity despite pressure from overwhelmingly powerful neighbors. The Three Kingdoms period established a pattern of Korean resistance to foreign domination that would prove crucial during later invasions, occupations, and cultural pressures. The peninsula had learned how to bend without breaking, how to absorb foreign influences without losing its essential character. The archaeological evidence tells this story in fragments of pottery, remnants of fortress walls, and tomb murals that still gleam with colors mixed over 1,000 years ago. Goguryeo tomb paintings in modern North Korea depict hunting scenes, astronomical charts, and mythological creatures that reveal a civilization confident in its cosmic significance. Baekdu's gilt bronze Buddhist statues demonstrate technical mastery and artistic vision that influenced sculpture throughout East Asia. Silla's golden crowns, discovered in royal tombs around Jeonju, represent goldsmithing techniques so sophisticated that modern artisans struggle to replicate them. These aren't just museum pieces, they're evidence of civilizations that achieved cultural heights that their contemporary European kingdoms could barely imagine. While medieval Europe was emerging from the chaos following Rome's collapse, the Three Kingdoms of Korea were creating art, architecture, and governmental systems that would influence East Asian civilization for centuries. The linguistic legacy is equally profound. Modern Korean preserves vocabulary, grammatical structures, and cultural concepts that originated during the Three Kingdoms period. The Korean language's complex honorific systems, its nuanced expressions of social relationships, and its particular ways of organizing thoughts and ideas all bear traces of the hierarchical societies that Goguryeo, Baekdu, and Silla developed. Even Korean cuisine reflects this Three Kingdoms heritage. The fermentation techniques that created kimchi, the rice cultivation methods that sustained Korean civilization, and the complex flavor profiles that distinguish Korean food from Chinese or Japanese traditions, all developed during this period. Korean cooks today are using techniques and ingredients that were perfected by Three Kingdoms farmers and artisans over a millennium ago. The religious landscape also bears their permanent imprint. Korean Buddhism, with its distinctive architectural styles, philosophical interpretations, and monastic traditions, represents a synthesis of Chinese Buddhist teachings with Korean cultural values that was forged during the Three Kingdoms period. Korean shamanism, which survived Buddhist and Confucian influences, preserves spiritual practices and beliefs that connect modern Koreans directly to their Three Kingdoms ancestors. Perhaps most remarkably, the Three Kingdoms period established Korea's fundamental geopolitical identity, a middle-sized power that maintains its independence through cultural sophistication, strategic patience, and the willingness to resist foreign domination regardless of the odds. This pattern established during the centuries when Goguryeo defied Chinese emperors, Baekje cultivated international relationships, and Silla played the long game, would repeat throughout Korean history. The Japanese invasions of the 16th century, the Chinese interventions of the 17th century, the colonial period of the early 20th century, and the division of the peninsula after World War II all echoed themes established during the Three Kingdoms period. Korean responses to these challenges, combining fierce resistance with cultural preservation, strategic accommodation with ultimate independence, followed patterns that were already ancient when Silla unified the peninsula. Modern scholars continue to debate the Three Kingdoms' influence on contemporary Korean society. Some argue that the bone rank system's hierarchical principles contributed to modern Korea's emphasis on educational achievement and social advancement. Others suggest that Goguryeo military traditions influenced Korean approaches to national defense, while Baekje's diplomatic sophistication shaped Korean international relations. What's indisputable is that the Three Kingdoms period created the foundational narratives that Koreans used to understand their place in the world. Stories of Goguryeo heroes defending mountain fortresses, Baekje scholars spreading Korean culture across East Asia, and Silla kings patiently building the institutions that would unify the peninsula, provide cultural touchstones that continue to influence Korean identity. The Three Kingdoms live on in Korean historical dramas, in the names of Korean cities and provinces, in the architectural styles of Korean temples and palaces, and in the collective memory of a people who learned over a millennium ago that independence requires both cultural achievement and strategic wisdom. Their legacy isn't just historical, it's actively present in Korean civilization today, shaping how Koreans understand themselves and their relationship to the wider world. So there you have it, 6.5 centuries of Korean history compressed into a single evening's journey through mountain fortresses, golden crowns, and the sort of diplomatic intrigue that would make modern politicians envious. The Three Kingdoms of Korea created a civilization that was simultaneously ancient and remarkably sophisticated, traditional, and innovatively adaptive. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you'll dream of misty mountains where ancient fortresses still guard empty valleys, of Buddhist temples where monks once copied sutras by candlelight, of royal courts where kings, wearing golden crowns, made decisions that would echo through centuries. The Three Kingdoms are gone now, absorbed into the larger sweep of Korean history, but their influence remains woven into the fabric of a civilization that learned how to preserve its essential character while adapting to an ever-changing world. Let the images fade gently, those Goguryeo warriors manning their mountain walls, those Baekje scholars teaching Japanese monks, those Silla nobles processing through Jeonju's ancient streets. History, after all, is most beautiful when it becomes part of dreams, when the distant past merges with the peaceful present of a quiet night and a comfortable bed. Sleep well, and let the echoes of ancient Korea carry you into whatever dreams await.